Thank- Okay, so good morning, all of you, and welcome to the third class of Tradition and Individual Talent. Now, in the last class, we discussed up to that point where Eliot says that the existing monuments form an ideal order among themselves. So, the existing monument or the existing works form an ideal order and which is modified when there is a new entry, because that existing monument gets changed or modified when there is an introduction of a new work of art, and which Eliot says the really new work of art among them. And then he says that the existing order is complete. The existing order is complete, but not closed, but complete before the new work arrives. So that is a complete work, that is a complete monument which gets modified or changed or realigned when there is an addition or supervention of a new work of art. The existing order is complete, he says, before the new work arrives. For order to persist after the supervention of novelty, so then what happens when the new work arrives, when the new thing is added, then what happens? There is a change, there is a modification in the existing order. And what happens when after the change or modification in the order, a new order is formed? So that is a modification of order. So there was an existing order before the introduction or addition of the new work. That order gets changed when there is a new addition or new supervention. The whole existing order must be, if ever so slightly altered, and so, and what happens? So when there is an addition, the order changes, the order changes, and the order is modified. And what happens? He said that that may be a very slight change in order, but that change is also a change. He says, if ever so slightly altered, and so the relations, proportions, values of each work of art towards the whole are readjusted. So if we think of the total order as a thing, as an arrangement which is made up of the unitary components. Suppose there are 5 to 6 unitary components, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or x, y, z, x1, y1, etc. Now what happens when there is an addition of a new thing or new item? The whole order changes, and with the change of the whole order, what happens? There is a change in the order between the relationships of those unitary components. He says that is the values of each work of art towards the whole are readjusted, and each unitary component, what is the thing? There is a sort of interconnectedness between the unitary components as well as the whole order. Now when a new item is added, a new unitary component is added, the interrelationship between each unitary component, that changes, as well as their relationship with the whole order, that too also changes. So there is a realignment, readjustment, modification of the whole order or the whole system. And that what Eliot wants to focus is that an addition of a very insignificant, it may be a very insignificant work of art, or it may be a very important work, or whatever it is, an addition, something added to the existing order makes a whole change, makes a whole readjustment and re-modification, realignment of the whole order, as well as their interrelationships between each unitary components, as well as their relationship with the whole. existing order, that all these change. Whoever has approved this, no, then he says whole are adjusted, and this is conformity between the old and the new, and this is what Eliot says as the conformity between the whole, between the old and the new. This is known as, so if a question comes that what Eliot wants to mean by the conformity between the old and the new, then you will be able to answer this from this particular section. Whoever has approved this idea of order, he says that whoever has approved this idea of order of the form of European, of English literature, will not find it preposterous that the past should be altered by the present as much as the present is directed by the past. Now, he says that from this particular item that Eliot has discussed, that what is the conformity between the old and the new, then he goes on to say that from this we can draw the inference that not only the past directs the present, or the past influences the present, at the same time the present also alters and modifies the past. So there is not just a one-sided relationship between the past and the present, but the movement, but the influencing activity, the modifying activity, that is two-sided, that the present also modifies and alters the past. It brings in a sort of realignment and readjustment in the existing order and introduces a new order. And the poet who is aware of this, he says that the poet who is aware of this will be aware of great difficulties and responsibilities. And once you are aware of this, that it is not only the fact that the past only influences me, but whatever I am writing is also, it also affects the past. It realigns or readjusts the past. Then you will feel a sort of heavy responsibility upon you that whatever I am writing, that is, if that needs to be acknowledged as a work of art, it's a serious work of art, then I should have to take it very seriously. And my responsibility is a very serious responsibility. It is a difficult task, obviously, for which, with which I can adjust and modify and review the past work. So to be a part of the tradition, it is not a very easy work. So there should be a great responsibility. There should be a difficult work for the poet or the artist to do, for which, with which he can or she can be a part of that tradition. Okay. In a peculiar sense, now this part, in a peculiar sense, he will be aware also that he must inevitably be judged by the standards of the past. Now, what he says is that there will be a judgment when I am writing something, or when I'm about to write something. I have to accept the fact that my work will be judged by the past works. Now, judgment is what? What Eliot wants to mean by judgment here. In a peculiar sense, he means the poet, he or the artist will be aware also that he must inevitably be judged by the standards of the past. I say judged, not amputated. So judging doesn't mean amputation, that I will be made inactive, or I will be amputated, or my activities will be restricted. It is not like that. I will be given the license, the freedom to work, but every time my work will be judged, it will be evaluated in the context of the previous works. I say judged, not amputated by them, not judged to be as good as, or worse, or better than the dead. He says that judging here means that that my work is getting judged by the works of the past, or my work is getting compared and contrasted with that of the past. That doesn't mean that this comparing or this judgment or this comparison or this judgment, it will be judged on the basis of whether my work is better than those works or my work is worse than those works. It is not like that. The judgment is not to do that. Then what? And certainly not judged by the canons of dead critics. And my works will not only be judged by the canons that have been created by the earlier critics. It is not like that. Then he says, then what is it? What judgment is? It is a judgment. It is a judgment, a comparison. He says it is a comparison. The judgment is a comparison in which two things are measured by each other. So judgment, Eliot says, it is not one-sided, that suppose I have written something, a new poet has written something, and my work or the new poet's work have been judged that this poem is as good as the earlier poet, or this poem is not as good as the earlier poet, or this poem, it has certain qualities which can be considered good, like the works of the earlier writers, or this work can be judged as good because they follow certain canons or certain rules laid down by the earlier critics. It is not like that. But what Eliot wants to mean by judgment, he says a judgment is a comparison in which two things are measured by each other. So the new work will be measured in respect of the old work, as well as the old work will be also re-evaluated in respect of the new work. So there, that will be a two-sided work. To conform merely would be, so what Eliot wants to mean by conformity? To conform merely would be for the new work not really to conform at all. He says that conforming here doesn't mean that the new work will completely conform to the earlier works. It is not like that. It would not be, it would not be new, and it would not be new and would therefore not be a work of art. If a new work completely conforms with the earlier works of art or earlier work, then it is not a new work. It is just a cyclostyle photocopy of the old work, and it is not a new work, and it is not a good work either. So it is what? It is just a reprint or a repetition of an earlier work. So conformity, according to Eliot, does not mean that that the new work will completely fit in with the earlier structures that have been made. But the new work should have certain connections with the old works, and the new work will be judged in the context of the works that have been done earlier, as well as the old works will be also re-evaluated in the context of those new works. So he says that for the new work not really to conform at all, it would not be new and would therefore not be a work of art. So if a new work completely resembles an older work, then it is neither a new work nor a good work. It is not a work of art, and it has nothing to add to that existing order. And we do not quite say that the new is more valuable because it fits in. And he says that we do not quite say, we never say that it is that the new is more valuable because the new, we cannot say this, or say like that the new is more valuable because it fits in. But its fitting in is a test of its value. Now, he says that if a work has certain connections with the older works, or it has certain certain relationship with the older works, that is not the sole thing which makes it a new and a good work, but it is a very important aspect which helps that work to be considered good as well as new. A test, it is true, which can only be slowly and cautiously applied, for we are none of us infallible judges of conformity. So he says that whatever quality the new work has, that quality should be judged and compared very cautiously, because none of us can demand that we are infallible judges of conformity. So what Eliot wants to say is that a new work should not be just a reprint or just a repetition of the older work, but it should have certain connections or certain references of the older work, which actually helps that work to get connected with the earlier works and therefore continue the tradition. We say it appears to conform and is perhaps individual. So this is very important. He says that a new work or new poetry or a new work of art should conform. At the same time, it should have certain individual traits in it, or it appears individual and may conform, or he says that it should appear individual and at the same time it should have certain qualities which helps that work to conform to the earlier works. We are hardly likely to find that it is one and not the other. He says we are hardly likely to find that it is one, and but most of the time Eliot says that we find that either the work is completely a work having individual traits but it has no connections, or it has whatever it has, it is just connected to the earlier works. It is just a reproduction or a reprint or repetition of an earlier work, or it has nothing individual in it. If that is the thing, if you find in a work of art, then it is nothing, it is not new, and at the same time it is not good, and it has nothing to do with the addition to the existing work of art or the existing tradition. To proceed to a more intelligible exposition of the relation of the poet to the past, he said that now I will proceed to the more intelligible exposition. He is getting into a very a comparatively what to say, the complex relationship, the study of the complex relationship of the poetry and the past, of the poet to the past. He can neither take the past as a lump and indiscriminate bolus. So he says that the poet should not take the past as a lump. So what is the past? So what is there behind me is just the past. It is just an indiscriminate bolus. So do you know the meaning of bolus? So bolus is when you eat food, when you swallow it, it turns into a bolus. It turns into a bolus. That is, you cannot discriminate or you cannot differentiate the things that you have eaten. It becomes a lump. Okay, so she says that the poet cannot take the past as an indiscriminate bolus, nor can he form himself wholly on one or two private admirations. He says that he cannot take the past as a bolus, as an indiscriminate bolus, so he should give due considerations for the due divisions and the component and the unitary components of the past. He should not take past as a as a homogeneous whole, as an indiscriminate bolus. At the same time, he should not take up certain things from the past as things which he privately admired. He says that nor can he form himself wholly on one or two private admirations. So he cannot choose one or two as the things that I privately admire, I personally admire, nor can he form himself wholly upon one preferred period, or a poet cannot take up a one particular period as his or her preferred period, that I want to follow this particular period. Then what you are doing, you are doing a sort of injustice to the past. So Eliot says that there are three tendencies that the poets generally do, or an artist generally do. That is, one, some people take the past as an indiscriminate bolus. Two, sometimes they do what? They take up certain things from the past as things that they privately admire, or some of them prefer a particular period or a particular trait. The first course is inadmissible. He says that the first thing is inadmissible. You cannot do that. The second is an important experience of youth. He says that some young people, they do this. They do what? They pick up the not only from they do what he formed wholly on one or two private admirations. They take up one or two things which they privately admire. So there should be no scope for your private admirations. Private admirations. Now here, from this particular point, we will see that Eliot is trying to introduce about the impersonal theory of poetry, which forms the second part of his essay. So there is no chance or no scope or no room for private admiration. So he says that that is something which we find uh, in the young poets. He says that it is an important experience of youth, and the third is a pleasant and highly desirable supplement. He says that the third is something which is highly desirable supplement. The poet must be very conscious of the main current. He says that you cannot just consider one particular period, or you cannot take up a particular thing for as you privately admire. He says that the poet should be a true poet, a good poet should be conscious of the main current, which does not at all flow invariably to the most distinguished reputations. He says that the poet should be conscious of the main current, which does not at all flow invariably, which invariably does not flow through the most distinguished reputations. So what happened when I think of the past, or if you are asked to say which English poet do you like, most of you will say Shakespeare, Chaucer, Dempster's the novelist, or Larkin, will say certain famous names. So distinguished reputations we try to remember, we like to remember as the past, and there is our tendency of taking up those reputed names as the normative reference of the past. Past poets, uh, an English poet of repute is questioned, and only Shakespeare. So there are many names in between. We forget them. And there is always a tendency of taking up those reputed names as the normative reference for the past. So Eliot says that a true poet should be aware of the main current of tradition, which is not that tradition, which tradition is neither only which tradition neither comprise the reputed names only. There are many other poets or writers who are there who are not considered reputed or that much famous, but they are also a part of the tradition. So a poet should be aware of the whole main current of tradition. He must be quite aware of the obvious fact that art never improves, but that the material of art is never quite the same. He says that art never improves, but the material of art, it changes. It changes. Okay. He must be aware that the mind of Europe, the mind of his own country, a mind which he learns in time to be much more important that his own private mind is a mind which changes, and that this change is a development which abandons nothing en route. He says that in order to understand the tradition, that great line, you need to know the very complex, comprehensive mind which is there in the tradition. This mind is not the mind of any particular individual or any particular artist, or the collective mind of any particular age. But this mind, he must be aware that to understand the tradition of Europe, you need to understand the tradition, the mind of Europe. And which mind? Which mind? The mind of Europe, the mind of his own country. And this mind, so this mind is made up of what? Very small components, and ultimately it creates a big comprehensive mind, a mind which he learns in time to be much more important than his own private mind. So this comprehensive collective mind, which forms the very heart of the tradition, this is not just a reflection, or this is not just a mind of any individual, but it is a complex, comprehensive, and collective mind. And a true poet needs to understand or feel that comprehensive and collective and comprehensive and collective mind. That is a mind which changes. So this mind is that develops, that changes, and that this change is a development which abandons nothing en route. And he says that this mind, while changing, it not abandons nothing which it gets or which it receives on its way. So this mind not never only takes the things from their reputed or distinctive identities. So this particular collective mind, it collects whatever it gets on its way. So this mind is neither the reflection of the mind of Shakespeare or Dryden or Larkin or Chaucer or Pope or James Joyce. It is not like that. But this mind, it collects whoever is there in the line of the tradition. So this mind abandons nothing en route, which does not superannuate either Shakespeare or Homer or the rock drawing of the Magdalenian draughtsman. So this mind not only takes what Shakespeare or Homer has given, but it also takes into consideration, but also it collects from those uh, painters or the Magdalene draughtsmen who drew on the on the rock. So this particular mind, Eliot says that a new poet or a new artist should be aware of. He needs to understand the very spirit of this collective and comprehensive mind, that this development, refinement, perhaps complication, certainly, he says that this development and refinement, and there is also complication, is not from the point of view of the artist any improvement. Now, from the point of the view of the artist, this this development of the mind, the artist uh, finds that there is no improvement in it. He says that not from the point of view of the artist an improvement, perhaps not even an improvement from the point of view of the psychologist, or not to the extent which we imagine. Perhaps, I'll read the line first, perhaps only in the end, based upon a complication in economics and machinery. But the difference between the present and the past is that, he says that the difference between the present and the past is that the conscious present is an awareness of the past. He says that the present becomes a conscious present when it is aware of the past. Okay. as an awareness of the past in a way and to an extent which the past's awareness of itself cannot show. So he says that what is the main important thing is that the present becomes a conscious present when it is aware of the past and to an extent which the past's awareness of itself cannot show. Okay. Someone said that dead writers are remote from us because we know so much more than they did. He said that he takes up somebody's line. The dead writers are remote from us. Why? Because we know so much more than they did. Now, they say that the dead writers are remote because we know something more than those dead writers. Precisely, and they are that which we know. And he says that the dead writers are remote and the present writers know more than the dead writers because the present writers also know about the dead. But the dead writers, they were not aware of the present writers. I am alive to a usual objection to what is clearly part of my program for the meteor of poetry. The objection is that the doctrine requires a ridiculous amount of erudition, pedantry, a claim which can be rejected by appeal to the lives of poets in any pantheon. He then says that about his writing that I am alive to a usual objection, that there is an usual objection about my writing to what is clearly part of my program for the meteor of poetry, that there is a very common objection about my poetry, Eliot says. The objection is that the doctrine requires a ridiculous amount of erudition, that to understand my poetry, the readers need a very they need a little amount of erudition and what he calls pedantry. So they need to know many things to understand what I have written. A claim which can be rejected by appeal to the lives of poets in any pantheon. He says that that particular claim which can be rejected, he says that that claim can be rejected by appeal to the lives of poets in any pantheon. So he says that if you read the other lives of poets that are there in the Hall of Fame, in the pantheon, so that claim will be rejected. It will even be affirmed that much learning deadens or perverts poetic sensibility. There is also a belief that too much learning only deadens or it disturbs or it kills the poetic sensibility. But while, however, we persist in believing, he says that we persist in believing that a poet ought to know as much as will not encroach upon his necessary receptivity and necessary laziness. He says that while, however, we persist in believing that a poet ought to know as much as will not encroach upon his necessary receptivity and necessary laziness. He says that a poet, if a poet knows, that ought to know, that a poet should know as much as that that will not encroach upon, that if a poet knows many things, that won't encroach upon or that won't disturb his necessary receptivity and necessary laziness. It is not desirable to confine knowledge to whatever can be put into a useful shape of examinations, drawing rooms, or the still more pretentious modes of publicity. He says that if there is a belief that poets, that too much of erudition, too much of information and knowledge that deadens or that kills the poetic sensibility. And then he says that while, however, we persist in believing, that though we persist, that though we still go on believing that a poet ought to know as much as will not encroach, that a poet can know many things and that will not disturb his necessary receptivity and necessary laziness. It is not desirable, he said that it is not desirable to confine knowledge to whatever can be put into a useful shape of examinations, drawing rooms, or the still more pretentious modes of publicity. Okay. Some can absorb knowledge and more tardy must sweat for it. So some people can absorb knowledge and some people work hard to absorb that. Shakespeare acquired more essential history from Plutarch than most men could from the whole British Museum. So he says that Shakespeare from gathered more history what from Plutarch than people gathered from the British Museum. So was Shakespeare a very scholarly person? Did he go to any history department or did he did any research work on history before writing the plays? No, he did not. But we get more information and things of history from his works than we can gather from the pages of or the artifacts of the British Museum. What is to be insisted upon is that the poet, he says that what we should focus on here is that the poet must develop or procure the consciousness of the past. So he says that Shakespeare could give you more sense of history, or Shakespeare could give you more information of history. Why? Because Shakespeare acquired that sense of the past. Shakespeare mastered that sense of history. And that is what he says. What is to be insisted upon is that the poet must develop or procure the consciousness of the past, and that he should continue to develop his consciousness throughout his career. So whatever or whenever the poet is writing something, he should have that consciousness of the past. At the same time, he should go on developing his consciousness of the past. He should never stop that. What happens is a continual surrender of himself as he is at the moment to something which is more valuable. He says, what actually happens is a continual surrender of himself. The poet continually surrenders himself as he is at the moment to do something which is more valuable. So he says that when a poet is planning to do something great, he should continuously surrender himself, surrender his personality, his ego, to before doing that valuable thing. The progress of an artist is a continual self-sacrifice. So when an artist creates, in order to create, he has to sacrifice his or herself. A continual extinction of personality. So now he goes on to the section of impersonal theory of poetry, that whenever the poet wants to create something great, he needs to negate his personality. He should continuously negate his personality. There should be a continual extinction of personality. There remains to define his process of depersonalization. So the poet should be in the process of depersonalizing himself and its relation to the sense of tradition. So the poet should depersonalize himself in order to relate himself with that sense of tradition. It is in this depersonalization, in this depersonalization, that art may be said to approach the condition of science. So he says that the poet here, while creating something significant or something good, the poet should be like a scientist. He should be very, or she should be very objective. And here he says that here the tradition of art connects itself, or it relates itself with that of science, that just like a scientist, a poet should be very much depersonalized while creating. He should negate himself, negate his personality. He should be within the process of continual extinction of his personality while creating, that he should approach the whole thing very objectively. I therefore invite you to consider as a suggestive analogy. Now he plans to give an analogy. The action which takes place when a bit of finely filiated platinum is introduced into a chamber of containing oxygen and sulfur dioxide. Now he will explain the role of the poet when he or she is creating, with comparing that with a scientific experiment, that what actually a platinum that is a finely filiated platinum that does. It works as a catalyst which actually helps to 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 uh, actually helps to for the reaction to happen quickly. It works as a catalyst, and this Eliot will explain in the next section while discussing the impersonal theory of poetry. So today up to this, thanks for being with me, and I'll let you know when I'll take the next class. So